Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, December 6th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The majority of American voters want a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. So polling continues to show that the majority of Americans favor a lasting ceasefire in Gaza, a position the Biden administration has rejected. So the latest poll from Data for Progress found that 61% of American voters support the idea of the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and general de-escalation of violence. And this includes 76% of Democrats who were asked, 49% of Republicans, and 57% of independent or third-party voters. When presented with arguments for and against the idea of a ceasefire, so I guess they were told what either side is saying about a ceasefire, the numbers changed a little bit. 52% of respondents still supported a permanent truce, while 34% opposed the idea, and 14% said they did not know what position to take. So this poll was conducted from November 22nd to the 25th, and it surveyed 1,201 likely American voters. So an earlier poll from Data for Progress in October found stronger support for the U.S. calling for a ceasefire, with 66% of respondents in favor, but it did not use the term permanent when posing the question. That was the real big difference I saw, was that this new poll said, would you support the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire? And when I first saw that poll in October, honestly, I thought it was too good to be true. You know, I kind of just doubted this idea that so many Americans would like to see the U.S. call for a ceasefire, but now we've seen several polls that are showing that. There was one from Reuters Ipsos last month in November that found 68% of Americans agreed with the statement that Israel should call for a ceasefire and try to negotiate, including 3/4 of Democrats and half of Republicans. And, you know, the Biden administration's position has been, they support, pauses, as they call them, humanitarian pauses, and they supported the hostage deal truce, but they are against the idea of a permanent ceasefire. They want to continue supporting Israel's war, Israel's slaughter in Gaza, and they're doing that by shipping weapons on a near daily basis, and that includes 2,000-pound bombs and all sorts of heavy munitions that Israel's using to destroy Gaza. And of course, there's the political cover, the U.S. deploying aircraft carriers to show that they're backing Israel in the region. And despite the massive civilian casualties in Gaza, the U.S. has maintained that the military aid, all the support for Israel, is unconditional. All right, so the next one here, House passes a bill that states anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So if you remember last week, the House passed a bill that said denying Israel's right to exist is anti-Semitism. And the only member of Congress that voted against that bill was Representative Thomas Massie, because his interpretation was that this bill was labeling anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, and he said he was against that. So after that bill passed, House Republicans introduced another one that explicitly states anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, which is completely absurd considering the amount of anti-Zionist Jews that I know, that I'm sure many of you know. It's just completely ridiculous on its face, but this bill still passed pretty easily through the House, although there was some dissent from Democrats. So this resolution, which was presented as a resolution condemning anti-Semitism, it passed in a vote of 314 to 14. 14 voted against, and 92 Democrats voted present. So that was most of the Democrats' protest, is that they voted present instead of voting against the bill. And again, buried in this bill is a line that says, the House of Representatives clearly and firmly states that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So what was interesting is that Representative Jerry Nadler, he's a Democrat from New York. He actually used to be my representative when I lived in Midwood, Brooklyn, which is a very Jewish neighborhood, and right next to Borough Park, where there's a lot of Hasidics and Orthodox Jews. And he came out pretty strongly against this language. And he said, quote, "The resolution suggests that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. That is either intellectually disingenuous or just factually wrong, and it unfairly implicates many of my Orthodox former constituents in Brooklyn, many of whose families rose from the ashes of the Holocaust." Nadler claimed that most anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, which I disagree with, but he added that if the authors of the bill, quote, "were at all familiar with Jewish history and culture, should know about Jewish anti-Zionism that was and is expressly not anti-Semitic. This resolution ignores the fact that even today, certain Orthodox Hasidic Jewish communities, the Satmars in New York and others, as well as adherents of the pre-state Jewish labor movement, have held views that are at odds with the modern Zionist conception," end quote. And I've seen those Hasidic Jews that, when I lived in New York, I would go to pro-Palestine events and rallies sometimes, and there's usually a group of Hasidic Jews that would show up with signs, Palestinian flags and everything. So Nadler came out strongly against the language, but he voted present. He did not vote against this. And again, this is Nadler. I mean, he's very pro-Israel. He's a total hawk these days. So, this isn't some anti-Israel politician saying this. This is a very pro-Israel politician who said that. So 13 Democrats voted against the bill, mostly progressives, and that included Jamal Bowman, Cory Bush, Gerald Connolly, Jesus Garcia, Raul Grilhalve, I totally butchered that name, Pramila Jayapal, Summer Lee, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Presley, Delia Ramirez, Bonnie Watson, Coleman, and Rashida Tlaib. Some of those names I didn't recognize, but some members of the squad is in there. So Thomas Massie, Republican from Kentucky, he was the only Republican to vote against this bill. The only one that voted against this bill that smeared basically all critics of Israel as anti-Semites. So, it's just really kind of a sad state of affairs that so many people in Congress voted in favor of this bill. But at least there was a little more dissent with this one because it was so explicit. Massey was right about the other bill. But, I think it looks like they put this bill up in response to what he did, to what he said. He's being really targeted by the Israel lobby. They're running ads against him in his state. He did an interview on Glenn Greenwald's show that we put in the blog, Massey, and it was interesting because I haven't really heard him talk much at length about Israel and his positions. So if you want to go check that out, we posted it in the blog. That's on Greenwald's show that he puts out on Rumble. All right, so the next one here, Israel used U.S.-made guided bombs to massacre 2 families. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And it says that Amnesty International conducted an investigation that found Israel targeted 2 Gaza homes with American-made joint direct attack munitions, killing over 40 people, including 19 children. The group said the U.S. has an outsized role and responsibility in using its leverage to curb civilian casualties in the besieged enclave. So this Amnesty report says, quote, JDAM were used by the Israeli military in 2 deadly unlawful airstrikes on homes full of civilians in the occupied Gaza Strip. The organization found that these airstrikes were either direct attacks on civilians or civilian objects or indiscriminate attacks and is calling for them to be investigated as war crimes. Amnesty International found distinctive fragments of the munition in the rubble of destroyed homes in central Gaza, following 2 strikes that killed a total of 43 civilians, 19 children, 14 women, and 10 men. In both cases, survivors told Amnesty that there had been no warning of an imminent strike, end quote. So JDAMs are kits that turn bombs into guided munitions with warheads ranging from 500 to 2,000 pounds. The U.S. has sent thousands of these kits to Israel since October 7th. And, this is just one example. I guess two examples. This is two strikes that they're talking about here of what is probably happening all over the Gaza Strip. Israel using American-provided weapons to destroy civilian homes and kill lots and lots of civilians. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. considers forming a Red Sea task force amid Houthi attacks. U.S. officials are considering forming a Red Sea task force with other nations after a series of attacks by Yemen's Houthis against commercial shipping that's come in response to the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. So National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said, quote, "We are in talks with other countries about a maritime task force of sorts involving the ships from partner nations alongside the United States in ensuring safe passage of ships in the Red Sea," end quote. So his comments came a day after the Pentagon said that a U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Carney, responded to attacks on 3 commercial vessels in the Red Sea that were launched from Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. The Pentagon said the USS Carney shot down 3 drones headed in its direction, but Sullivan said that the U.S. cannot assess if the U.S. warship was purposefully targeted. So they're kind of downplaying that incident, while there's been other reports of officials and, of course, hawks in Congress criticizing the Biden administration, saying they're downplaying the threat to U.S. ships. And the Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, they took credit for attacks on 2 of the commercial vessels. They did not say that they attacked an American Navy ship. So going back, the one example I could find of something similar happening in recent years, I guess this is a while ago now. This was back in 2016. So the U.S. has backed the Saudis against the Houthis, the Saudi-UAE coalition against them, since 2015. So the Houthis consider themselves to be at war with the U.S. If you read their media, any sort of Saudi military action they call U.S.-Saudi aggression. But it's rare that the U.S. and the Houthis directly fight. And one example I found was in 2016. The U.S. accused the Houthis of targeting a U.S. Navy ship, and they bombed them. So something like that could definitely happen, and this could really derail the truce that's held, the relative truce that's held between the Saudis and the Houthis since April 2022. There's been some fighting, ground fighting, shelling across the border, but the Saudis have not been bombing Yemen, and the Houthis have not been firing rockets and missiles into Saudi territory. So this is the risk of the U.S., say they do decide to directly target the Houthis. All right. So I want to take this moment to mention again that it is our fundraiser at antiwar.com. This is the first week. This is how we operate. This is how we survive. This money that people donate goes directly to funding the site. We don't have much overhead. It's really just kind of the bare bones that we need to just keep going. It goes directly to paying the small staff and keeping the lights on the website. So this is how we're able to maintain our, editorial line and our independence, is by being funded by our readers and now the listeners and viewers of this show. So if you go to antiwar.com/donate, you can see the different ways that you could help us. Any amount that you give helps out. And it's the end of the year, so we're a nonprofit, so anything you donate can be written off on your taxes, so you don't have to give it to the IRS to fund, what Israel's doing in Gaza. You could give it to us instead. So go to antiwar.com/donate and see the different ways you could help out. All right, so to get back into the news, the next story here, Netanyahu wants an open-ended occupation of Gaza, which, we already knew. He's basically reaffirming that point. So Netanyahu said on Tuesday that he wants Israel's military to maintain an open-ended occupation of the Gaza Strip after the current war. Netanyahu said, quote, "Gaza must be demilitarized, and in order for Gaza to be demilitarized, there is only one force which can ensure this demilitarization, and this force is the Israel Defense Forces. No international force can be responsible for this," end quote. So Netanyahu's comments come after a report from Politico said that the Biden administration has been drafting this big plan. It sounds like they've put a lot of time into this for the Palestinian Authority, the PA, to take over post-war Gaza, and the PA administers some areas of the West Bank. But Netanyahu has made very clear that he is opposed to this idea. And according to a report from Israel's Kan 11 broadcaster, Netanyahu recently told members of the Knesset, quote, "Not only will there not be a renewed Palestinian Authority in Gaza after the war, there will be no Palestinian Authority in Gaza at all," end quote. So that report said that Netanyahu had expressed his view on the matter to the U.S. And besides Netanyahu's strong objections, another issue with the PA is that they've lost legitimacy to the Palestinians after decades now, since it was formally formed in 1993 when the Oslo Accords were signed. They failed to protect Palestinians in the West Bank from incursions by settlers and from Israeli forces. They live under this constant military occupation. So they're not really looked at as a legitimate option to lead Palestinians. So that's another issue. And we know, based on leaked documents and things that Israeli officials have been saying publicly, that the ultimate goal for Netanyahu and his government is to kick all the Palestinians out of Gaza and just get rid of them. The biggest thing standing in their way is opposition from Arab countries and regional countries. All right, so the next one here, this is a pretty big story from Haaretz. Despite intel warnings, Israeli army did not evacuate the Nova festival. So top Israeli defense officials held urgent consultations the night before the October 7th attack about a possible Hamas attack. But no one in the IDF notified the Nova festival organizers or the partygoers, hundreds of whom were mown down, and for 9 hours, no one came to save them. So for 9 hours, the festival goers were on their own. So this has some more details about the warnings that the Israeli military got, not in the months leading up to the attack, but the night before and the morning of, that they knew something was going on, and they did not tell these people that were at this music festival right near the Gaza border fence that the Israeli army approved to actually be extended. I believe originally it was supposed to end on Friday, but they approved it to extend another day. So anyway, I'll just read some from this article. It says, hours before Hamas's October 7th terror attack, Israel's security forces had enough warning signs to prepare, at least partially, for the possibility that terrorists would seek to infiltrate from Gaza into Israel. Despite the fact that the Gaza Division's Northern Brigade approved the Nova Music Festival staging in the Kibbutz Re'im parking lot, was responsible for its security, and its commander was aware of the warnings, no one in the IDF notified the thousands of partygoers or the party's organizers of their concerns or demanded that the event be shut down. Moreover, it turned out that the army units that were on alert in the area at the start of the Hamas attack had no knowledge of the party, didn't even know what was going on, even though the army approved it. In the earliest hours of the massacre, party organizers called the officer with whom they had been in contact and were told that the forces were in disarray and that they would have to manage on their own. The result was about 360 festival attendees were murdered by terrorists, and at least another 40 were taken as hostages into the Gaza Strip. And Haaretz also reported that when the Israeli military did finally show up, at least in some cases, Israeli military helicopters their fire hit Israeli civilians as well when they were attacking the Hamas fighters. So just more about the intelligence failure of the Israeli government. All right, so the next one here, Israel shuts NGO for reporting the rape of a teenager by Israeli forces. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and it says that Israeli authorities banned a Palestinian NGO after it reported the rape of a Palestinian child by Israeli forces to the U.S. State Department in 2021. And this was said by former State Department official Josh Paul, who recently resigned in protest of what Biden is doing, what the U.S. and Israel are doing to Gaza. And he said this in a CNN interview on Monday. So Paul said that Israeli forces had raided Defense for Children International Palestine's offices and designated it a terrorist organization. That followed a complaint made by the U.S. State Department about the rape of a 15-year-old Palestinian boy in Al-Mascobia, a detention center in West Jerusalem. Paul said, quote, "They removed their computers and declared them a terrorist entity," end quote. So the DCIP, that's the abbreviation for the organization, they specifically focus on Palestinian children's rights. So interesting account there from this former U.S. State Department official. All right, so the next one here, Kyiv mayor says that Zelensky is an authoritarian. Sorry, that went to a different article. That's the wrong link. We got to fix that. Sorry, I'm going to find this article. So this is Klitschko, Vitaly Klitschko. He is the mayor of Kyiv, former heavyweight boxing champion, and he has said that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is turning Ukraine into an authoritarian state as public criticism of Ukrainian leadership is becoming more common. So he told Der Spiegel the other day, quote, "At some point, we will no longer be any different from Russia, where everything depends on the whim of one man," end quote. So in a separate interview, Klitschko also sided with Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny, who was recently rebuked by Zelensky for saying the war had turned into a stalemate and that there was no chance of a breakthrough. Klitschko said, quote, "Zaluzhny told the truth. Some may not want to hear the truth, but we can't lie to our people and partners indefinitely," end quote. So saying that Zelensky is lying about the war. And recent internal polling has shown that Zaluzhny, again, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, the top general, has a good chance of beating Zelensky in a future presidential election, and that the Ukrainian public trusts the general much more than the president. Ukrainian presidential elections are scheduled for March 2024, but Zelensky has ruled out the idea of holding a vote if the war is not over by then. So Ukraine's constitution does not allow elections during martial law, although Zelensky previously said that holding a vote was possible if it was bankrolled by the West. If they gave enough money, then they could possibly have an election, but he has since ruled out the idea, saying elections are not appropriate at this time. So Klitschko also accused Zelensky of not being prepared for Russia's February 2022 invasion. He said, quote, "People wonder why we weren't better prepared for this war, why Zelensky denied until the end that it would come to this. People see who's effective and who's not, and there were and still are a lot of expectations. Zelensky is paying for the mistakes he has made," end quote. So Klitschko, a lot of people know who he is. I mean, from his boxing career, his brother, I forget his brother's first name, but they were both like I think his brother was more of a champion, like was a better boxer, but they were both like pretty serious contenders in the, heavyweight champions, back in kind of the early 2000s. I think he retired in 2013, right before the coup in Kyiv that he was involved in. All right, so to get into the next story, this is another one from the Washington Post about their report on the Ukrainian counteroffensive and the planning that has gone into it. So this story says that in Ukraine, a war of incremental gains as counteroffensive stalls. So this is, again, a pretty long, detailed report from the Washington Post. I went over the first part yesterday, and they have these kind of bullet points that I just want to go over. So 70% of troops in one of the brigades leading the counteroffensive and equipped with the newest Western weapons entered battle with no combat experience. Ukraine's setbacks on the battlefield led to rifts with the United States over how best to cut through deep Russian defenses. The commander of U.S. forces in Europe could not get in touch with Ukraine's top commander for weeks in the early part of the campaign, amid tension over the Americans' second guessing of battlefield decisions. Each side blamed the other for mistakes or miscalculations. U.S. military officials concluded that Ukraine had fallen short in basic military tactics, including the use of ground reconnaissance to understand the density of minefields. Ukrainian officials said the Americans didn't seem to comprehend how attack drones and other technology had transformed the battlefield. I laughed a little bit. I shouldn't be laughing because of how many people died in this counteroffensive, but just how much the blame, it's just a blame game now. The U.S. officials blaming the Ukrainians, and that was going on throughout the counteroffensive. Again, in reports that I was covering about the U.S. saying Ukraine is too casualty averse. They're too worried about their men getting killed. On the other hand, if they were that worried, they wouldn't have sent them into this battle anyway. So it says, in all, Ukraine has retaken only about 200 square miles of territory at a cost of thousands of dead and wounded and billions in Western military aid in 2023 alone. So just not a good situation. All right, so the next one here, tempers erupt at a classified Senate briefing on Ukraine. So this article's from The Hill. I thought it was fine. It's rare that we run stuff from The Hill, but kind of saw this last minute. So tempers boiled over during a classified Senate briefing on Ukraine on Tuesday afternoon when Republican senators insisted on talking about security along the U.S.-Mexico border, while Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and military officials tried to keep the discussion focused on the war. So what's interesting here is that Schumer accused Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell of attempting to hijack the meeting on Ukraine's defense needs to have an unrelated conversation on border security. So Mitch McConnell, a very staunch supporter of Ukraine, who previously said supporting Ukraine should be the number one priority for Republicans, seems to be prioritizing the border stuff more. At least maybe he's just trying to keep people in his party happy. He definitely still wants to pass this $61 billion for Ukraine, but it looks like they're really trying to get some concessions out of the Democrats. So Zelensky was scheduled to attend the briefing via a secure video conference call, but he canceled his appearance shortly before the meeting. I wonder why he canceled it. It didn't say why. But the discussion got so heated that at one point, Senators Tom Cotton and Kevin Cramer, both Republicans, were shouting questions at the senior Biden administration officials in the room, including Blinken, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and the new Joint Chiefs Chairman Charles Q. Brown Jr., and basically just yelling about the border. So lots of infighting in the Senate going on here, and still struggling to pass all this Ukraine aid. But Schumer has scheduled a vote to advance Biden's huge $106 billion request for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan. There's going to be some kind of vote on that on Wednesday, which he expects to fail. So we'll see what happens. All right, so the next one here, Commerce Secretary says that China is the biggest threat ever. So Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo called for tighter export controls on advanced technologies going to China and labeled Beijing the biggest threat we've ever had. So Raimondo made the comments at the annual Reagan National Defense Forum in California. This was on Saturday. And again, I missed this over the weekend, but I mean, this is some really crazy stuff that she says. She said, quote, on matters of national security, we got to be eyes wide open about the threat. This is the biggest threat we've ever had, end quote. She said that there were areas where the U.S. and China could cooperate and that Washington needed to manage its relationship with Beijing, but added, quote, make no mistake about it, China's not our friend, end quote. So since taking her post as Commerce Secretary, Raimondo has overseen a ramping up of significant economic sanctions on China, including recent measures to limit Beijing's access to advanced semiconductors. I know some of them. Recently, the restrictions were related to advanced semiconductors that can work with AI technology. And the U.S. justifies the restrictions by claiming that it is trying to prevent China's military from using the technology, but the chips being banned have many different uses. I mean, there are all sorts of things that these advanced microchips are used for. So explaining her actions, Raimondo said, quote, I know there are CEOs of chip companies in this audience who were a little cranky with me when I did that because you're losing revenue. Such is life. Protecting our national security matters more than short-term revenue. Newsflash, democracy is good for your business. Rule of law here and around the world is good for your business, end quote. So she said that the U.S. could not let China catch up to it when it comes to technology. She said, quote, we're a couple of years ahead of China. No way are we going to let them catch up. We cannot let them catch up, so we're going to deny them our most cutting-edge technology, end quote. So Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin hit back at Raimondo, saying that the U.S. should stop seeing China as an enemy. And he also said that the U.S. should, quote, stick to the right perception and work with China to deliver on the common understandings reached in the San Francisco meeting, end quote. He's talking about when President Biden and President Xi Jinping just had a meeting and agreed to work in certain areas. Right after that, Biden called Xi a dictator again. And here you have Raimondo, who, since she came in, since the moment she was grilled by the Senate during confirmation hearings in the very beginning of the Biden administration, she said, China's the biggest threat. We got to stop China. We got to stop their economic development, is essentially what she has said. And then you have other Biden officials say, no, that's not what we're trying to do. It's all about national security. And then you have her say things like this. And to China, it's all very blatant and obvious. And, it just goes to show, like, you would think they would have a little more discretion, a little less hubris about just saying things like this openly. If you know anything about China, she did another interview recently saying China's got to play by the rules if they want to do business with us. And it's just not conducive to diplomacy or working things out with China, which is not what they want to do, obviously. But that is it for the news for today. There's a lot of stuff. I hope I picked the right stories to prioritize here. But go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Ramsey Baroud, History of Gaza on Conquerors, Resurgence, and Rebirth. One from Kathy Kelly, Predicting Pestilence in Gaza. One from Ivan Alland, America is an Overstretched Superpower. One from Ryan McMacken, Henry Kissinger, War Criminal and Enemy of Mankind. One from David C. Hendrickson, The Morality of Ending War Short of Total Victory. So still lots of stuff for you to go check out at antiwar.com. You could go look at our blog. You could go scroll down to the lower section of the page where we have all sorts of other news stories, lots of stuff about Gaza, lots and lots of content. But that is it for me for today. Again, please help with our fundraiser. If you like this show, antiwar.com/donate. Share the show, tell your friends, all that stuff. I will be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.